Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. Tonight, we examine a seemingly innocent photograph from the early 20th century, a little girl's tea party captured in 1907. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than a charming glimpse into Edwardian childhood, but look closer, and a chilling reality emerges from the sepia-toned innocence. The photograph shows a sunlit garden setting, where a young girl of perhaps 6 or 7 years sits primly at a small wooden table draped with white linen. She wears a high-necked dress with puffed sleeves, her hair neatly arranged with ribbons, the picture of Edwardian propriety. Before her, a delicate china tea set is arranged with meticulous care, steam still rising from the freshly poured cups. But it's the empty chairs that draw our attention. 3 of them, to be exact, each with its own place setting: a cup, saucer, and small plate with what appears to be a slice of cake. These vacant seats face the camera directly, as if their occupants had momentarily stepped away. The little girl seems engaged in conversation, her mouth caught mid-sentence, her hand gesturing toward one of the empty chairs as if responding to a question. According to family records that accompanied this photograph, young Elizabeth Harrington had lost 3 siblings to diphtheria the previous winter, 2 brothers and a sister aged 4, 8, and 10. Yet here she sits in the garden of their countryside home near Bath, England, hosting her regular Sunday tea party as if nothing had changed. Her parents initially thought Elizabeth was simply processing her grief through play, a common enough coping mechanism for children. The tea parties had been a weekly tradition among the siblings. But when Elizabeth's mother developed the photographs taken that day, she noticed something that sent a chill through the household. In Elizabeth's diary, found tucked beneath her pillow, neat childish handwriting recorded the events of that Sunday. James liked his cake very much today. Mary said the tea was too hot. Thomas told us a funny story about angels. All 3 children mentioned had been buried in the small churchyard just beyond the garden wall for nearly 6 months. More disturbing still, when questioned about her imaginary tea party, Elizabeth appeared confused. "They aren't imaginary, Mother," she reportedly said. "They come every Sunday. They're very hungry now." The photographer, Elizabeth's father, later claimed that when taking the picture, he felt sudden, unexplainable cold spots where each empty chair stood, despite the warm June sunshine. He also noted that when developed, the photograph showed 3 distinct shadows cast by the empty chairs, shadows that appeared to take human form. What makes this image particularly unsettling is not just a child's innocent inability to process loss, but the question that haunts us. In the space between the living and the dead, what might a child perceive that adults cannot? And in that garden in 1907, who or what might truly have been joining young Elizabeth for tea? Elizabeth's mother, Catherine Harrington, initially dismissed the shadows in the photograph as a trick of light, an artifact of the developing process. She tucked the disturbing image into a drawer in her husband's study and tried to forget it. But as the summer of 1907 stretched on, the weekly tea parties continued, each one punctuated by Elizabeth's increasingly detailed accounts of her siblings' visits. "Elizabeth claims Mary's cough has gotten better," Catherine wrote in her private journal. "It seems a cruel irony, as it was that very cough that took her from us in February." By August, servants in the Harrington household began reporting strange occurrences. The upstairs maid refused to enter the nursery after finding 3 sets of small, damp footprints leading from the wash basin to the toy chest where the tea set was stored. The gardener complained about finding the garden gate that led to the churchyard unlatched each Monday morning, though it was always secured with a padlock on Saturday evenings. Dr. Morrison, the family physician who had treated the children during the diphtheria outbreak, suggested Elizabeth's behavior represented a form of extended grief. "The child has created an elaborate fantasy," he explained to the concerned parents. "It will pass with time and gentle guidance." But on the first Sunday in September, exactly 9 months after the first child had fallen ill, Elizabeth's father decided to set up his camera again. The resulting photograph, now held in the Bath Historical Society archives, shows an even more troubling scene. Again, Elizabeth sits at her tea table, but now the steam rising from the cups at the empty place settings appears more substantial than that from Elizabeth's own cup. The 3 shadows have grown more distinct. Most disturbing of all, the slice of cake on the plate nearest Elizabeth shows what looks unmistakably like bite marks. In Edwardian England, spiritualism had gained significant popularity, particularly among those grieving loved ones lost to the era's many devastating illnesses. The Spanish influenza was still years away, But tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and diphtheria claimed countless children yearly. The Harringtons, previously stoic adherents to the Church of England, began to explore more esoteric explanations for the phenomena surrounding their daughter. They consulted Madame Sylvia Thornhill, a medium of some repute who had conducted seances for members of London society. Upon entering the Harrington Gardens, Thornhill reportedly stopped at the tea table and refused to go farther. "They are tethered here," she told Catherine. "Your children cannot leave because Elizabeth will not release them. Each Sunday tea renews their connection to this world when they should be journeying to the next." The medium's visit coincided with a marked decline in Elizabeth's health. The child, who had seemed oddly robust in the months following her siblings' deaths, now grew pale and listless, except during the Sunday gatherings, when her cheeks would flush with color as she poured tea for her invisible guests. The family cook later testified that Elizabeth had asked for larger portions of cake each Sunday, explaining, "They're so hungry now, and I have to give them some of my strength so they can stay." At the autumn equinox, Catherine Harrington made a fateful decision. She would attend one of Elizabeth's tea parties herself, against her husband's protests that such encouragement would only deepen the child's delusion. Beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, Catherine placed a fourth chair at the garden table and waited with her daughter. "You mustn't sit there," Elizabeth said sharply when Catherine chose a seat. "That's where Thomas sits. He's the eldest and likes to watch the birds." She pointed to another chair. "You may sit here between Mary and James." The temperature dropped perceptibly as tea was poured. Catherine later described a sensation like plunging one's hands into winter well water when she reached for her cup. Though she saw nothing but vacant chairs, she felt an unmistakable pressure against her skirts, as if someone small leaned against her. Elizabeth carried on 3 separate conversations simultaneously, answering questions Catherine couldn't hear, laughing at jokes not spoken, passing sugar to empty air. But most disturbing was the moment Catherine watched a piece of cake on James's plate diminish bite by bite, crumbs falling to the tablecloth from invisible lips. "How do they come to you?" Catherine finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elizabeth smiled indulgently, as if explaining something obvious. "Through the gate, Mother. They wait in the churchyard until I call them for tea." She lowered her voice confidentially. "It's ever so difficult for them to cross over. That's why they need my help." The following morning, Dr. Morrison was summoned urgently to the Harrington home. Elizabeth had not awoken, her small body feverish, her breathing labored. As he examined the child, the doctor noticed something unusual. 3 distinct bruises on her inner wrist, each the size of a small fingertip, as if something had held her too tightly. In her delirium, Elizabeth spoke continuously to her siblings. "I don't want to go yet," she repeated. "Mother needs me here." The local vicar was called to perform last rites, but upon entering Elizabeth's bedroom, the elderly man staggered backward. "There are others here," he gasped, clutching his prayer book. "God have mercy." By midday, Elizabeth rallied unexpectedly. Her fever broke, and color returned to her cheeks. The family dared to hope for recovery, until the child told them with perfect clarity, "I've made a bargain. I can stay until Christmas, and then I must join them. They need someone to look after them on the other side." The final photograph in the series was taken on Christmas Eve, 1907. It shows the tea table set with 4 cups, none of them Elizabeth's. The little girl stands behind the chairs, her image slightly blurred as if she were already fading from this world. Her expression is not one of fear, but of serene anticipation. Elizabeth Harrington passed away peacefully in her sleep that night. The cause listed as complications from previous household infection. The tea parties ceased, the garden gate remained locked, and the shadows no longer appeared in photographs. 5 years later, when grief had dulled to memory, Catherine Harrington visited the family plot on a bright Sunday afternoon. There, arranged on the flat stone that now bore 4 children's names, she found a miniature tea set, no larger than doll furniture, with 4 tiny cups, each containing what appeared to be freshly poured tea, still steaming in the cool cemetery air. In 1982, 75 years after the Harrington tragedy, historian Verity Collins discovered the tea set photographs while researching childhood mortality in rural England. The images had been preserved in a private collection, accompanied by Catherine Harrington's journal and several letters exchanged between the grieving parents in the months following Elizabeth's death. Most compelling was Robert Harrington's correspondence with the Society for Psychical Research. dated January 1908. In precise, measured handwriting, the father, a man known locally as a skeptic and rational thinker, documented a series of events that occurred after Elizabeth's funeral. "The children's bedroom remains undisturbed," he wrote, "yet each morning, the bed linens appear rumpled in distinctive patterns. 4 small depressions, as if children had sat together telling stories. The toy chest opens and closes of its own accord. Most peculiarly, the miniature tea set, which Catherine buried with Elizabeth, has reappeared on the nursery shelf, often still damp as if recently washed." Verity's research took an unexpected turn when she located Harriet Simmons, a kitchen maid who had worked in the Harrington household during this period. Now 93 years old and living in a nursing home near Devon, Harriet's recollections remained startlingly vivid. "Mrs. Harrington insisted we set 5 places at the dining table each evening for months after the little miss passed," Harriet recalled. "Mr. Harrington humored her until Easter morning, when we all heard the sound of children laughing in the garden. It wasn't natural laughter. It echoed as if coming from inside a well." Parish records revealed that Catherine Harrington became increasingly involved with spiritualist groups, eventually converting the garden shed into what locals called her communion room. Robert, meanwhile, abandoned photography entirely, destroying his equipment in what servants described as a night of terrible distress, after claiming to discover all his glass plates imprinted with the same image: 4 children having tea in a misty garden that resembled neither this world nor the next. Most disturbing was Verity's discovery when she finally located the Harringtons' former property. The house had burned down in 1929, but the garden wall remained, including the gate that once connected to the churchyard. The current owners, an elderly couple named Pearson, had sealed it with concrete after purchasing the land in the 1960s. "The previous owners warned us never to open it," Mrs. Pearson explained, serving tea in her modern kitchen overlooking the overgrown garden. "They said children would come through on Sundays if given the chance." Almost as an afterthought, Mrs. Pearson mentioned the clay fragments their grandchildren occasionally unearthed while playing. Tiny broken pieces of what might once have been teacups, each no larger than a thimble, that seemed to reassemble themselves when left overnight. "The strangest thing happened last summer," Mr. Pearson added quietly. "Our granddaughter Sophie, she's 6, set up her play tea set by that old wall. When we called her in for supper, she insisted on leaving it out because the children from the gate haven't finished yet. We thought nothing of it until morning when we found 4 perfect bite marks in each piece of cake she'd left." The Pearsons' account intrigued Verity enough that she extended her stay in the village, establishing a rapport with little Sophie during afternoon visits. The child spoke matter-of-factly about her gateway friends, who appeared precisely at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoons, describing them in unsettling detail: Thomas with his perpetually wet shoes, Mary who smelled of medicine, James who could only whisper, and Elizabeth who seemed to be in charge despite being younger than Thomas. "Elizabeth says they used to live here," Sophie explained while arranging her plastic teacups. "She says they're lonely because their mother stopped waiting for them." Verity obtained permission to set up recording equipment near the sealed gate. For 3 Sundays, nothing unusual registered beyond typical garden sounds: birdsong, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves. On the 4th Sunday, however, the temperature probes recorded a 17-degree drop precisely at 4 o'clock, lasting exactly 45 minutes before returning to normal. The audio recordings from that session, now preserved in the University of Edinburgh's Paranormal Studies Archive, contain what audio specialists identified as 4 distinct breathing patterns beneath the ambient noise: 3 regular and 1 labored, as if from congested lungs. Most compelling was the EVP segment captured at 4:23. A high, clear voice saying, "She promised to come back for us." Technical analysis confirmed the voice belonged to no one present during recording. Village records yielded another connection when Verity discovered that Sophie's maternal bloodline traced back to the Harringtons through a cousin who had inherited the property after both parents died in 1912. Catherine had hanged herself from the garden gate on Easter Sunday that year. Robert had followed 2 days later with an overdose of laudanum. Their shared gravestone bore the inscription, "Reunited with their beloved children in God's garden." The local church maintained a curious tradition that began shortly after the Harringtons' deaths. Each Christmas Eve, the smallest tea set from the children's Sunday school would disappear, only to reappear scattered across the Harrington graves the following morning. After several replacements were similarly borrowed, the congregation began intentionally leaving one out, a practice that continued uninterrupted until 1967, when the vicar, attempting to debunk the superstition, locked the tea set away. That Christmas, every child in the Sunday school reported the same nightmare. 4 pale children pressing their faces against bedroom windows, asking to be let in because it's time for tea. When Sophie's parents planned to move for work reasons, the child became inconsolable, insisting she couldn't leave her tea time friends. The night before their departure, the family was awakened by Sophie's screams. They found her backed against her bedroom wall, pointing at 4 wet sets of footprints that led from the garden door to her bed. Elizabeth says if I go away, they'll need to find another friend, Sophie whispered. She says they'll follow us anywhere until it's my turn to pour the tea. In 1990, Verity Collins published her findings in an academic paper that was largely dismissed by her colleagues. The manuscript, along with her collection of evidence, was relegated to the university archives, folklore and superstition section. Shortly thereafter, Verity abruptly abandoned her academic career and moved to New Zealand, refusing all correspondence regarding the Harrington case. What remained unpublished was Verity's personal journal, discovered after her death in 2017. The final entries revealed why she had fled her research. 3 months after her investigation at the Pearson property, she received a small parcel with no return address. Inside was a child's handkerchief embroidered with the initials EH, still damp to the touch, wrapped around a note written in unsteady, childish script. Won't you join us for tea next Sunday? More alarming were the photographs Verity had taken in her own London flat, ordinary snapshots of her desk and research materials. When developed, each showed the same anomaly. 4 small shadows gathered around her teacup, visible only when she examined the negatives. The most compelling evidence emerged after Sophie Pearson's family relocated to Australia. The new owners of the Pearson house, the Millers, had no children and knew nothing of the property's history. Within 6 months, they had demolished the remaining garden wall, including the sealed gate, to make way for a swimming pool. During excavation, workers uncovered a small metal box containing 4 porcelain dolls arranged in seated positions around a miniature table. Each doll's face had been carefully painted over with a different expression of distress. On the underside of the table was scratched, "Catherine, please let us go." Construction halted when the project manager's daughter, visiting the site with her father, vanished for several hours. She was eventually found sitting in the dirt of the excavation, meticulously setting places with stones and leaves. When asked who she was playing with, 7-year-old Emma Miller pointed to the empty air around her and said, "The gate children need somewhere to have their tea now that their door is broken." Parish records from the months following the wall's destruction noted an unusual pattern. 4 separate families in the village reported children speaking of new playmates who only came for tea and left wet footprints behind. Each child described the same 4 visitors: the oldest boy with serious eyes, the girl who coughed, the quiet middle boy, and their leader, a girl with ribbons who told them wonderful secrets about the other side. The Miller family abandoned their renovation and sold the property at a significant loss just 10 weeks after moving in. Their departure was hastened by a discovery made by Mrs. Miller: 4 small indentations that appeared nightly on their mattress, as if invisible children sat watching them sleep, and Emma's increasingly troubling statement, "Elizabeth says I'll be pouring tea for everyone soon. She says it's almost my turn." The Harrington case might have remained an obscure footnote in paranormal research if not for social media bringing it back to public attention in 2020. A vintage photography account posted the original tea party image, which quickly went viral with the caption, "Little girl's tea party in 1907. Until you notice she set places for dead siblings." Amateur investigators descended on the village, much to the residents' dismay. The property, which had changed hands 12 times since the Millers left, stood vacant again. Local estate agents admitted they struggled to keep tenants beyond a single season, especially families with children. What these online sleuths couldn't have known was that the village had developed its own protective rituals. Each Sunday afternoon, the church bells rang at precisely 3:55, 5 minutes before the traditional tea hour, a warning heeded by all residents to keep their children indoors until sunset. Dr. Meredith Zhao, a child psychologist specializing in grief manifestations, gained access to previously sealed hospital records from 1932 through 1968. She discovered 7 separate cases of children from the village or surrounding areas hospitalized with identical symptoms: extreme fatigue, unexplained bruising on the wrists, and what doctors had termed parasomnia with shared delusion elements. All 7 children had reported tea parties with 4 specific spectral attendees. More disturbing were the outcomes. Of those 7 children, 5 had died within 9 months of symptom onset, each death occurring on a Sunday between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. The remaining 2 survived only after their families moved more than 100 miles away. The pattern suggests something beyond mere psychological contagion, Dr. Zhao noted in her research paper. These children appear to have been experiencing genuine physiological depletion, as if something was literally drawing life energy from them during these perceived tea parties. The current vicar, Reverend Thomas Winfield, reluctantly shared a church tradition maintained by every parish leader since 1912. Each Sunday, a small table with 4 settings was placed in the churchyard near the Harrington plot, complete with tea and cake. The offerings would be untouched, but the tea always cooled at an unnatural rate. My predecessor explained it as a containment measure, Reverend Winfield explained. As long as we acknowledge them, they remain tethered to this ground. The alternative is unthinkable. In a final unsettling development, archivists digitizing 19th century parish registers discovered that before the Harringtons purchased their property, 4 other children had died there during a scarlet fever outbreak in 1863. Their names, Thomason, Marion, Jacob, and Eliza, bore uncanny similarities to those of the Harrington children. Photographs of these earlier children showed them posed around a small garden table with a tea set, their faces solemn. Penciled on the back was a note, "The children's final tea party." They insisted on being photographed thus, saying they would continue this tradition always. The question remains, did the Harrington children join a gathering already in progress? And who pours the tea now that Elizabeth has had her turn? The Shadow Frames exhibition acquired a new donation in 2023, a leather-bound journal discovered during renovations of an old nursing home outside Bath. The facility had once been the sanitarium where Catherine Harrington spent 3 weeks between her husband's death and her own suicide. The journal belonged to Nurse Edith Winters, who had been assigned to Catherine's care. Mrs. H speaks continuously of a bargain she claims her daughter made, Nurse Winters wrote. According to her ravings, the child Elizabeth offered herself as a caretaker to her deceased siblings, but with a terrible condition that she would need to find replacements every generation to sustain them. More disturbing were the nurse's observations about Catherine's physical state. The patient bears unusual markings on her inner wrists and ankles, perfect circles the size of a child's fingertips. These bruises appear to renew themselves nightly, though no one enters her room. Dr. Fleming suggests self-harm, but the patterns are impossible for her to reach herself. The final pages described Catherine's last night at the facility. Mrs. H became suddenly lucid around tea time. She smiled as if greeting someone and said clearly, "I understand now, my darlings. Mother will help you rest properly." She requested paper and pen, writing 4 names in a circular pattern before tearing the paper into squares and swallowing them one by one. Parish burial records confirmed that when Catherine's body was exhumed to be placed alongside her husband, the workers found 4 small porcelain cups buried with her, each containing soil from a different child's grave. Anthropologist Dr. Imani Okoro has connected the Harrington phenomenon to pre-Christian traditions of binding rituals meant to keep the souls of children from wandering. The tea ceremony functions as both tether and doorway, she explained. The living child serves as anchor and energy source while the dead children exist in a liminal state, neither fully here nor fully departed. Most recently, in October 2024, excavations for a new housing development near the former Harrington property unearthed something impossible. The skeletal remains of 4 children holding hands in a circle, estimated to be from the Iron Age, nearly 2,000 years before the Harrington tragedy. In the center of their circle lay fragments of crude clay vessels arranged in a familiar pattern. The developer halted construction after several workers reported seeing children playing near the excavation at dusk. They were running in and out of the foundation holes, one worker said. But when we called out, they just stood in a line and stared. Their clothes kept changing, like they were flickering between different times. Local folklorist Martha Jennings has collected 27 distinct stories of spectral tea parties from British Isles mythology, dating back to medieval chronicles. The trope remains consistent, she noted. Children who die together require a living child to maintain their connection to this world. The tea ritual appears across cultures, sometimes as milk, sometimes as water or blood, but always as a shared cup that passes energy from the living to the dead. The most recent family to purchase the haunted property, a couple with no children, reports no unusual occurrences. "We simply leave 4 cups of tea in the garden every Sunday," they explained. "We never watch, never photograph, never invite them further. Some traditions are meant to be maintained, not questioned." In 2025, the tranquility surrounding the former Harrington property was shattered when archaeologist Dr. Eleanor Wright purchased the adjacent land. A specialist in childhood burial practices throughout British history, she'd been drawn to the area after reading Dr. Okoro's papers linking the site to ancient binding rituals. "This isn't just about ghosts or grieving families," she explained to reluctant local officials. "What we're witnessing may be the longest continuous ritual observance in recorded history, a tradition spanning millennia rather than centuries." Eleanor's excavation began respectfully enough, with traditional offerings placed at the property boundary each Sunday. But her academic curiosity proved stronger than her caution. After 3 months of regular tea rituals, she introduced a modification, replacing one of the cups with a specially designed vessel containing sensors to measure temperature fluctuations, pressure changes, and moisture levels. The readings defied scientific explanation. Between 4 o'clock and 4:45 each Sunday afternoon, the liquid in the cup appeared to be consumed by infinitesimal sips, while simultaneously maintaining its volume. More alarming, spectrographic analysis detected trace elements of human tissue, specifically cells consistent with the oral mucosa of children between 4 and 10 years of age. "They're not just drinking the tea," Eleanor confided in her research assistant Thomas. "They're somehow feeding on it while simultaneously infusing it with themselves. A perfect closed loop of energy transfer." Against the warnings of villagers, Eleanor set up 4 high-definition cameras to capture the ritual. Each Sunday, the footage showed nothing unusual to the naked eye, but when processed through specialized filtering software designed to detect subtle light variations, ghostly outlines appeared, 4 small figures whose appearances shifted constantly between different historical periods. Most unsettling was the 5th figure that began to appear in late June, a tall, slender shadow that stood behind the children, its hand resting on Elizabeth Harrington's shoulder. Unlike the children, this presence remained consistent throughout the recordings. "It's watching us through them," Eleanor whispered after reviewing the footage. That night, she awoke to find her bedroom door ajar and 4 small indentations on the foot of her bed, as if children had sat watching her sleep. The local vicar visited Eleanor's dig site the following morning, his face grave. "The bargain has terms," he warned. "The children are merely its instruments. What truly binds them here is far older and hungrier than any human grief." That evening, Eleanor discovered her censer cup had been moved from the tea table to her porch, filled not with tea but with dark soil. Buried in the soil was a small piece of yellowed paper bearing a child's handwriting. "It wants more. We tried to warn them all." When Eleanor attempted to have the soil analyzed, her research assistant Thomas reported that the sample had transformed overnight into ordinary tea leaves. More disturbing still, the original Sunday recordings had altered upon review. The 5th figure now stood directly behind the camera position, its featureless face aimed not at the children, but at Eleanor herself. The village archives, recently digitized and made available to researchers like Eleanor, revealed a peculiar historical footnote long forgotten by local historians. In 1841, decades before either the Scarlet Fever outbreak or the Harrington tragedy, the original estate had belonged to Professor Augustus Merriweather, an Oxford theologian with unconventional interests in what he termed the thin boundaries between worlds. Merriweather's journals, preserved in the university's restricted collection, described his decade-long study of the property's unusual properties, particularly the area where the garden wall and gate would later stand. His meticulous notes documented a natural formation beneath the soil, a perfect circle of stones that predated Roman occupation, which he believed marked a doorway through which the vale grows permeable. Most disturbing were Merriweather's final entries from the autumn of 1853. After losing his 4 grandchildren to consumption over a single month, the grieving academic became convinced he could establish contact using what he called the ancient method of sustenance. His final journal entry, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, detailed a ritual involving teacups placed on the stone circle at precisely 4 o'clock. "The children have returned," he wrote. "They accept my offerings but remain hungry for more than mere tea. They speak of a presence behind them, something that guides their movements and promises reunion if only I continue the ritual. I have pledged my remaining days to their nourishment. Parish death records indicated Merriweather passed away exactly 9 months later, his body discovered in the garden. The coroner noted unusual desiccation, as if the very essence had been drawn from him gradually. Neighbors reported seeing Merriweather speaking to empty chairs each Sunday, growing increasingly frail while insisting his grandchildren looked healthier with each visit. Eleanor discovered a previously overlooked connection when she cross-referenced land survey maps from 7 different eras. The placement of the tea ritual had shifted slightly with each generation, but always maintained precise alignment with celestial markers that would have been significant to pre-Christian inhabitants. The summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset intersected exactly at the point where the gate had stood. Most chilling was Eleanor's discovery in the county archaeological repository, a collection of Iron Age artifacts found during a Victorian excavation but never properly catalogued. Among broken pottery and rusted implements lay a small stone tablet carved with primitive figures. 4 small forms arranged around a table-like structure, while a larger figure loomed behind them. The curator's notes mentioned unusual resistance to carbon dating and the unsettling tendency of the artifact to be found in different positions each morning despite being locked in a sealed display case. When Eleanor arranged to have the tablet transported to her research facility, the delivery never arrived. The transport driver reported no memory of collecting any artifact, while security footage from the repository showed the display case standing empty hours before the scheduled pickup, though no one had accessed the room. That evening, Eleanor found the stone tablet sitting in the center of her garden tea table, the carved figures now facing her cottage window. By morning, it had disappeared again, leaving behind only 4 perfect tea-colored circles burned into the wooden tabletop. The legacy of the Harrington tea rituals expanded beyond the village when curator Annabeth Chen discovered an unusual Victorian photograph album at an estate sale in Canterbury in early 2026. The album contained no family portraits or typical scenes, but rather 47 separate photographs of tea settings, each one with 4 cups arranged in identical patterns, taken at different locations across England between 1865 and 1902. Marginalia beside each image, written in the same meticulous hand, noted precise coordinates, dates, and times, all Sunday afternoons at 4 o'clock. Most disturbing was a recurring notation: nourishment provided, passage denied. When Annabeth cross-referenced these locations with Eleanor Wright's research, a pattern emerged. Each site corresponded to documented cases of multiple child deaths within a single family, followed by reports of a surviving child engaging in elaborate tea rituals before their own eventual passing exactly 9 months later. It's not simply a haunting, Annabeth theorized in her correspondence with Eleanor. It's a carefully maintained network, geographical points where the boundary is deliberately kept vulnerable through ritualized energy exchange. The curator traveled to the British Library to examine the private papers of Lady Emmeline Farrington, a Victorian spiritualist whose name appeared in connection with 3 of the album's locations. Among Lady Farrington's effects was a sealed envelope marked Tea Circle Containment Protocols, Destroy After My Death. The documents inside revealed a coordinated effort among 19 wealthy families with spiritualist leanings who had lost children to illness. Rather than attempting to banish or exorcise what they encountered, they had established a system of controlled interaction, regular feedings through tea ceremonies conducted by appointed adult guardians rather than surviving children. We have reached an arrangement with the custodian, Lady Farrington wrote in 1883. The children remain as vessels, but their hunger is satisfied through our willing participation rather than innocent sacrifice. The doorway remains closed as long as the ceremony continues. Most significant was the identity of this custodian, an entity Lady Farrington never named directly but described as ancient beyond mortal reckoning, and neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply hungry for the particular energy only children naturally generate. When Annabeth shared these findings with Eleanor, the archaeologist made a devastating connection. Her ground-penetrating radar surveys had identified a network of subtle geological anomalies connecting the original Harrington property to 6 other locations within a 20-mile radius, each one corresponding to a site in the Victorian album. They weren't trying to contact their dead children, Eleanor realized. They were trying to contain something that was using the children as conduits. The tea ritual wasn't born from grief. It was a sophisticated binding mechanism disguised as innocent remembrance. On the autumn equinox of 2026, Eleanor and Annabeth conducted a final experiment. Following Lady Farrington's detailed instructions, they prepared the tea table with specific herbs mixed into the brew, positioning the cups at precise angles to the setting sun. As 4 o'clock approached, they retreated to observe from a safe distance. What their cameras captured would force both women to abandon their research entirely. As the tea began to steam in the afternoon light, the liquid in all 4 cups transformed, not evaporating or spilling, but rising in slender columns that twisted together above the table to form a shape that resembled nothing human or natural, a presence that seemed to pull light itself into its core. The University Ethics Committee suspended Eleanor and Annabeth's research after reviewing their disturbing footage, confiscating their materials under the guise of procedural violations. Yet both women received anonymous envelopes containing identical antique keys the following week, with notes reading simply, Archives Basement, Section 14C. The underground repository they discovered beneath Canterbury Cathedral had no official listing in any university or church record. Row upon row of meticulous documentation stretched back centuries, journals, photographs, and film reels, all cataloging the same ritual performed at different locations across Britain, each maintained by designated keepers who understood their solemn responsibility. An elderly archivist named Margaret Holloway emerged from the shadows, startling them. "We've been expecting you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "Every generation someone rediscovers the pattern. You're not the first researchers to find your way here." Margaret revealed herself as the last surviving member of a lineage dating back to Lady Farrington's original circle, families who had maintained ritualized containment since Victorian times. What began as desperate parents seeking contact with their deceased children revealed something far more ancient, she explained, retrieving a volume bound in faded leather. The book contained detailed illustrations of prehistoric stone arrangements found across Britain, each resembling a crude table with 4 seats. Archaeological surveys had dismissed them as ordinary hearths, but carbon dating revealed each site had been repeatedly visited every century, with organic material dating across thousands of years. "The entity has existed since before human memory," Margaret said. "Our ancestors called it the Hungry One. It cannot fully enter our world, but reaches through thin places, using children who've glimpsed the other side as its conduits." Margaret explained that grieving families unwittingly activated these portals through their rituals of remembrance. The dead children are caught between worlds, not malevolent themselves, but tethered to the Hungry One. They return because they must, drawing energy from the living to feed what waits behind them. Most disturbing was Margaret's revelation about the Harrington property. It's the anchor point, the strongest connection between worlds. The gate wasn't built to keep anything out, but to keep something in. Catherine Harrington's tragic mistake was breaking the controlled ritual her predecessors had maintained. Only then did Eleanor understand the true purpose of the Victorian spiritualists' elaborate tea ceremonies, not communication, but containment, performed by adults strong enough to provide sustenance without being consumed. When Elizabeth Harrington became her siblings' caretaker, she unknowingly disrupted this balance. "The ritual must continue," Margaret insisted, showing them photographs dating from 2010, the Pearson family's garden, the Miller's excavation, and 12 other locations across Britain where children reported spectral tea parties. "But it's weakening. Too many sites have been abandoned or disturbed." Eleanor shivered as Margaret placed a weathered photograph on the table. The image from Eleanor's own camera the previous Sunday, impossible as that seemed. In it, the 5th presence behind the children appeared more substantial than before, its outline sharper against the garden backdrop. "The Hungry One grows impatient," Margaret whispered. "The children have always been both its prisoners and its lure, but after centuries of feeding through this controlled ritual, it has learned enough about our world to seek a different way through." The ritual's guardians had maintained their watch for generations, but Eleanor realized the pattern of succession had fractured. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she arranged photographs across the archive table, each showing the current stewards of the remaining active sites, all elderly, all without trained replacements. "We're the last," Margaret explained, adjusting her cardigan against the cellar's chill. "In my grandmother's time, 23 families maintained the boundaries. Now only 7 remain." The tradition became difficult to explain to modern sensibilities. Eleanor studied a map where red pins marked abandoned ritual sites, blue pins the active ones. The pattern resembled a vast geometric sigil stretched across Britain, its integrity visibly compromised like a net with too many broken strands. "What happens if all the rituals stop?" Annabeth asked, her fingers tracing the connection between points. Margaret's silence answered more eloquently than words. Finally, she retrieved a journal dated 1939. During the war, the London Circle was broken when bombing destroyed the Hartwick family home. For 7 days, the ritual lapsed. She opened the journal to a page of frenzied handwriting. 7 children from different families disappeared within 48 hours. They returned physically unharmed 9 days later, but the journal detailed clinical examinations of the returned children. Their bodies functioned normally, but something essential had been altered. They spoke in perfect unison despite being kept in separate locations. They drew identical images of a table set for tea, but with a 5th cup at its center. Most disturbing, they no longer cast shadows. "The entity has been patient," Margaret continued. "It understands human patterns now. Our grief, our love for our children, our willingness to sacrifice. It's been learning through every generation of children it has held between worlds." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's temperature. The Harringtons weren't the beginning. They were simply another layer of containment, like changing bandages over an ancient wound. "Precisely," Margaret nodded. "Each family believes their ghost story is unique, personal. They don't realize they're maintaining a ritual thousands of years old." Annabeth leafed through site photographs, stopping at an image of a cave painting estimated to be 12,000 years old. It showed stick figures, 4 small ones arranged around a circular object, and a larger, more angular form looming behind them. "What does it want?" Eleanor whispered. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "What does any hungry thing want? To feed without restriction. The children are merely its tasting spoons. It wants the feast." The archivist pulled out a leather case containing 4 antique silver teaspoons, each engraved with different family crests: Harrington, Merriweather, Farrington, and Holloway. These were crafted from silver mined at the anchor sites. When the original containment was established, each family took responsibility for 1/4 of the ritual. Eleanor hesitated before asking, "And the 5th presence?" "We never name it," Margaret said sharply. "Names have power, but it's growing stronger as our numbers dwindle. The last guardian at the Kensington site passed 3 months ago. His replacement never arrived for training." She slid a newspaper clipping across the table, an obituary for a 7-year-old who had drowned in her bath at precisely 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. The child's final drawing, reproduced in the article, showed 4 children and a tall figure having tea. The gathering dusk cast long shadows across Canterbury Cathedral's courtyard as Eleanor and Annabeth hurried toward the archive entrance, silver teaspoons wrapped carefully in velvet cloth within Eleanor's satchel. Margaret's final instructions echoed in their minds. "Establish a new containment circle before the winter solstice, just 14 days away. We need 4 guardians," Eleanor murmured, consulting the faded map they'd been permitted to take. 1 for each cardinal direction, each with a bloodline connection to the original families if possible. Annabeth's research had yielded 3 potential candidates, distant relatives of the Victorian Circle families, all living within 50 miles of the Harrington anchor site. But we're still missing the 4th, she reminded Eleanor. Without completing the circle, their conversation halted as both women noticed something peculiar about the cathedral's western entrance. Despite the clear December afternoon, fog seemed to cling to the ancient doorway, swirling in patterns too deliberate to be natural. When they approached, the mist retreated like a living thing. "It's testing boundaries," Eleanor whispered. Margaret said it would grow bolder as solstice approaches. That evening in Eleanor's cottage, they spread their materials across the dining table, far from the garden where the ritual tea set remained untouched. The silver spoons gleamed under the lamplight, each subtly different in design, yet sharing an uncanny resonance when arranged in formation. Eleanor's phone chimed with an email notification, results from the genealogical service she'd commissioned. "There's our 4th, she said, scanning the document. "Charlotte Merriweather, 28, living in Bristol, direct descendant through the female line." The profile included a photograph of a solemn-faced young woman with striking eyes. Most notable was her profession, children's hospice nurse. "She already stands at the threshold between children and what waits beyond," Annabeth observed. She might understand better than most. As they prepared to contact Charlotte, a soft tapping sound drew their attention to the kitchen window. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, yet they could discern small handprints appearing in the condensation. 4 distinct sets, pressed from the outside, sliding downward in perfect unison. More unsettling was what happened when Eleanor approached the window. The handprints stopped their descent, then deliberately rearranged themselves to form primitive letters, HELPUS. "They've never communicated this directly before," Eleanor breathed, her scientific detachment momentarily shattered. The handprints vanished, replaced by a new message, NOTUS. Then, after a pause, BEHINDUS. Eleanor reached for her phone to document the phenomenon, but the screen displayed only static when aimed toward the window. As she lowered it, 5 distinct chimes sounded from her garden, the sound of silver teaspoons tapping against fine china. "Nobody's out there," Annabeth whispered, peering between the curtains. Yet the garden table was now visible in the moonlight, the tea set arranged precisely, steam rising from cups that had been empty moments before. Most disturbing was the 5th cup at the center, larger than the others, fashioned from what appeared to be dark metal rather than porcelain, its contents too black to reflect even moonlight. Margaret's journal had warned them. When it prepares its own place at the table, the final breach is near. That night, as Eleanor finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her phone chimed once more. A text message from an unknown number contained only 4 words. "The children are waiting." Eleanor woke suddenly at precisely 3:33 in the morning, her breath fogging in the inexplicably cold bedroom. On her nightstand, the silver Harrington spoon vibrated with subtle energy, causing her water glass to hum a single, sustained note. Outside her window, the first flurries of unexpected snow swirled in perfect circular patterns across her garden. She reached for her phone to call Annabeth, only to find herself staring at a child's drawing as her lock screen wallpaper, one she certainly hadn't set herself. 4 crude stick figures held hands around a table, while a 5th figure, disproportionately large and drawn entirely in black, loomed above them. The drawing pulsed slightly, the black figure seeming to grow incrementally with each second. "It's accelerating," she whispered, throwing back her covers. When she entered her study, Eleanor found her research materials rearranged. Her maps and photographs now formed a precise geometric pattern across the floor, a pentagram with the Harrington property at its center. At each point lay an old newspaper obituary, 5 in total, each reporting the death of a child exactly 9 months after their siblings had passed. The phone in her hand buzzed, displaying Charlotte Merriweather's name, though Eleanor hadn't yet contacted her. "I've been dreaming about children having tea parties." Charlotte's voice came through without preamble. "For weeks now. They keep saying I need to come home. I haven't been to the village since my grandmother's funeral." Eleanor clutched the phone tighter. "When did these dreams begin?" "Autumn equinox," Charlotte replied. "And they're getting worse. Last night they told me the door is opening, and only family blood can close it again." Through the window, Eleanor watched as the snow accumulated on her garden table, building small mounds that resembled seated figures. More alarming, a 5th, taller drift was forming at the head of the table, its contours sharpening with each passing minute. "Charlotte, you need to come immediately," Eleanor said, watching the snow formation extend what looked like an arm toward her house. "Bring anything you have that belonged to your ancestors, especially—" "The silver spoon," Charlotte interrupted. "My grandmother made me promise never to lose it, said it was more important than I could understand." The line crackled with static, and through it, Eleanor heard what sounded like children's voices chanting in unison, their words just beneath comprehension. "I'll be there by noon," Charlotte said. "The hospice just called. All our current patients are suddenly asking for tea parties, even the ones who can barely speak. They're all drawing the same picture." As dawn broke, Eleanor received simultaneous messages from the other 2 descendants she'd identified. Both reported identical phenomena: family heirlooms vibrating, snow formations resembling tea parties, and dreams of children calling them home. The final boundary was weakening faster than Margaret had predicted. Whatever had waited patiently for generations was now rushing toward its opportunity, using the approaching solstice as its doorway. Eleanor looked again at her garden. The snow formations had vanished, leaving instead perfect circular indentations in the untouched powder, 4 small ones and 1 large one, as if invisible entities had sat there all night watching her windows, waiting for her to understand what was truly at stake. The snowfall intensified as Eleanor gathered the 4 silver spoons, wrapping each in silk handkerchiefs she'd found in Margaret's archive. Outside her cottage, the morning light struggled to penetrate the unnatural cloud formation centered directly above the garden table. Weather reports showed clear skies everywhere else in the county. By 11:30, Annabeth arrived with Daniel Farrington, a middle-aged librarian whose grandmother had whispered tea ritual stories to him throughout his childhood. He clutched a worn leather case containing his family's spoon, his fingers trembling slightly. "I always thought they were just stories," he said, watching the snow swirl in tight spirals around Eleanor's garden. "Last night, all the books in my flat rearranged themselves, every single one open to pages containing the word tea." Catherine Holloway, Margaret's grandniece, arrived shortly after, bringing not only her family's spoon, but a journal dated 1873. "This belonged to my ancestor who participated in the original Victorian containment," she explained. "Last night it fell from its shelf and opened to this." The page detailed emergency protocols if the entity ever approached manifestation. "Should the hungry one prepare its own place at the table, only the unified bloodlines may prevent the veil's complete rupture." As they waited for Charlotte, Eleanor's garden continued its impossible transformation. The snow beneath the tea table had melted completely while everywhere else it accumulated. Steam rose from the bare patch of earth, carrying a scent like copper and crushed herbs. "It knows we're gathering," Catherine whispered, clutching her spoon tighter. "My great-aunt Margaret believed it had gained awareness over centuries of feeding, that it had developed preferences." Daniel nodded grimly. "My grandmother said it particularly favored children with imagination. The more vividly they could picture their departed siblings, the more useful they were as conduits." A taxi pulled up outside, and Charlotte Merriweather stepped out, her medical scrubs partially visible beneath her winter coat. She carried a small wooden box inlaid with silver. "I left mid-shift," she explained, her eyes immediately drawn to the garden. Every child in hospice care began drawing the same image simultaneously. Even the comatose patients sat up and reached for pencils. She opened the box, revealing not only the expected spoon, but something the others lacked, a small silver key. "My grandmother said this opened something important at the original site. I never understood what she meant." As Charlotte approached, the unnatural stillness of the garden shattered. The teacups on the table began to rattle, the snow around them melting in expanding circles. The fifth, larger cup, the one that hadn't been there yesterday, tipped onto its side, spilling not tea but a viscous black liquid that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Where the liquid touched the ground, frost patterns spread outward, forming intricate diagrams reminiscent of the maps in Margaret's archive. "It's drawing a pathway," Eleanor realized with growing horror, "from here to every ritual site across Britain." A child's laugh, or something approximating one, echoed from everywhere and nowhere. The trees surrounding Eleanor's property bent inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the winter sunlight, casting the garden in premature dusk. "We need to get to the original site," Catherine said urgently. "Before 4 o'clock, before tea time." The four guardians gathered their belongings as the air around Eleanor's cottage grew increasingly distorted, sound waves bending to create whispers that seemed to originate from inside their own minds. Catherine studied Charlotte's silver key with growing recognition. "The lock," she murmured. "There's an actual physical mechanism at the anchor site, something Victorian engineering devised to reinforce the metaphysical boundary." As they hurried to their vehicles, Eleanor noticed something they'd all overlooked. Each silver spoon bore not just a family crest, but a tiny inscription along the handle's underside. When placed together in sequence, the words formed a single instruction: "Feed not the hunger, but the home." The drive to the Harrington property took them through increasingly strange weather patterns. Snow fell in perfect geometrical shapes rather than natural flakes. Along the roadside, they passed 5 separate children standing alone in fields, each one turning in unison to watch their cars pass, each raising a hand in identical greeting. "They're not real," Charlotte whispered, her medical training providing clarity the others lacked. "Notice how they don't sink into the snow. Those are projections, echoes of the entity's previous vessels." The village appeared deserted when they arrived, curtains drawn tight against windows, doors secured with symbols Charlotte recognized from her grandmother's journals, protective sigils dating back to pre-Christian Britain, designed specifically to repel what dwelled between worlds. "They know," Daniel said softly. "The village has always known but couldn't stop maintaining the ritual. The cost of failure was too great. At the Harrington property, now abandoned after its last owners fled 3 months earlier, the temperature dropped dramatically as they approached the garden gate, the infamous boundary between worlds that had been rebuilt countless times. Unlike Eleanor's garden, no snow had fallen here. Instead, the ground remained bare in a perfect circle 30 feet in diameter, centered on the weathered tea table that somehow remained intact despite decades of exposure. Catherine approached the ancient wall, where the gate now stood sealed with modern concrete. "The Victorians didn't build this wall," she said, running her fingers along the stonework. "They discovered it. These are foundation stones from a Roman temple, which itself was built upon a Neolithic site." Charlotte examined the concrete barrier, her fingers finding an imperceptible seam that others couldn't detect. "There's something here," she whispered, producing her grandmother's key, a mechanism hidden within the newer materials. The key slid into what appeared to be a natural crack in the concrete, engaging with something that clicked with mechanical precision. A section of the wall pivoted inward, revealing not the churchyard they expected, but a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The true anchor isn't the gate, Eleanor realized, checking her watch. 3:17 in the afternoon. It's whatever lies below it. As they hesitated at the threshold, a child's voice called from the bottom of the stairs. "Please hurry. It knows you're here, and it's almost tea time." The narrow staircase descended in a perfect spiral, each step worn smooth from centuries of passage. The guardians moved in formation, Charlotte leading with her grandmother's key, followed by Catherine, Daniel, and Eleanor bringing up the rear. As they descended, the temperature fluctuated wildly, pockets of bitter cold alternating with waves of oppressive warmth. "The children who died here," Charlotte whispered, her medical training providing insight. "They didn't just die of diphtheria or scarlet fever. The illnesses were real, but they were also selected." Daniel nodded grimly. "My grandmother's journal mentioned similar patterns in each affected family. The strongest children always survived the longest, almost as if something was testing their resilience." At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a circular chamber hewn from bedrock. At its center stood a stone table with 4 smaller seats and 1 larger throne-like chair. The arrangement mirrored the tea tables above ground, but carved with precision that predated modern tools. The walls bore faded paintings showing the same scene repeated through different historical periods: Roman, medieval, Victorian. Always 4 children at tea with a looming presence behind them. "It's been here all along," Eleanor breathed. The tea parties above were just echoes of this original ritual. Catherine approached the wall, studying the oldest section of paintings. "These markings are Proto-Celtic, possibly older. This site was sacred long before Britain had a name." In each carving, the 4 small figures appeared to be passing something to the larger entity. Not cups, Eleanor realized, but small glowing objects that resembled souls. Charlotte moved to the stone table, noticing 4 shallow depressions that perfectly matched the bowls of their silver spoons. "The Victorians didn't create the containment ritual," she said. "They rediscovered it and adapted it to their understanding. The spoons are keys." As the clock on Eleanor's phone displayed 15 minutes to 4, the chamber began to vibrate subtly. Dust rained from the ceiling as footsteps, light but distinct, echoed on the staircase behind them. "They're coming," Daniel whispered. "All of them." The footsteps multiplied, creating a cascade of sound like dozens of children descending together. Yet when Eleanor turned toward the entrance, she saw only 4 small figures silhouetted against the dim light. A tall boy, a girl clutching her throat, a quiet middle child, and their leader with ribbons in her hair. "Elizabeth Harrington," Catherine breathed, "and her siblings." The spectral children approached not with menace but with urgent purpose. Elizabeth extended her transparent hand toward the silver spoons. "It's time," she said, her voice somehow both childlike and ancient. The custodian grows impatient. "We've held it back for so long, but the hunger has become too great." Behind the children, the staircase darkened as something much larger began its descent, a presence that seemed to absorb rather than displace the air around it. Eleanor felt pressure building in her ears as reality itself bent around whatever approached. "Place the spoons." Elizabeth's voice took on a desperate edge. "Complete the circle before it reaches the table. 400 years we've served as its vessels, passed between families as guardians weakened. Please, help us go home." The 4 guardians moved with synchronized urgency, each taking position at one cardinal point around the stone table. The weight of generations pressed upon their shoulders as they placed their ancestral spoons into the depressions that had waited centuries for their return. The silver gleamed with unnatural brightness in the subterranean gloom. "Feed not the hunger, but the home," Charlotte whispered, finally understanding the cryptic inscription. "We don't give it what it wants. We give the children what they need, passage back to where they belong." As the final spoon touched stone, the chamber resonated like a struck bell. The spectral children visibly strengthened, their translucent forms gaining definition while the oppressive darkness on the stairwell recoiled. Elizabeth Harrington smiled with genuine childish relief for perhaps the first time since her death. "The spoons aren't just keys," Eleanor realized aloud. "They're conduits, meant to channel energy toward the children instead of away from them. The entity has been inverting the ritual for centuries, stealing what was meant to give these children peace." The walls of the chamber illuminated, revealing hundreds more ghostly children standing in concentric circles around them. Generations of vessels, all bound to the same hunger, watching with desperate hope. Catherine recognized faces from obituary photographs spanning 2 centuries. Daniel's hands trembled as he completed the invocation Margaret had taught them. "We call to the 4 directions, to the 4 seasons, to the 4 elements. We call to the blood of our ancestors who understood the true meaning of the circle." The darkness on the stairwell consolidated into a towering figure of pure absence. Not shadow, but the negation of light itself. It reached with limbs that seemed too numerous and too long, but found itself unable to approach the table where the silver spoons now pulsed with brilliant energy. "It fed on transition," Charlotte explained, her hospice experience bringing sudden clarity. "Not death itself, but the liminal space between life and death where children linger. It kept them suspended as eternal conduits, neither fully dead nor truly at peace." The entity contorted in silent rage as the spoon's light connected with each child in the chamber, forming a complex web of silver threads. Elizabeth and her siblings stepped forward first, their faces transformed from eternal sorrow to quiet dignity. "We've been waiting for someone to understand," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger now. "Every generation we tried to warn them through the tea ritual. Most adults saw only what they wanted. Beloved children returned. They couldn't see what waited behind us, growing stronger with each false communion. The stone beneath their feet began to shift, revealing not solid earth but a perfectly circular pool of still water, the true doorway home, hidden beneath layers of ritualistic misdirection. "The tea was never meant for the entity," Eleanor said with dawning comprehension. "It was meant for the children, sustenance for their final journey, perverted into an anchor that trapped them here." As the clock struck 4, the hundreds of spectral children moved toward the pool in solemn procession. The entity thrashed against invisible barriers, its hunger undiminished but its power waning as each child passed beyond its reach. Elizabeth Harrington turned one last time before stepping into the waters, addressing not just the 4 guardians, but generations of well-meaning adults who had perpetuated her binding through misguided love. "Don't mourn us with chains," she said simply. "Remember us with open hands." As the final spectral child disappeared beneath the silver-threaded waters, the underground chamber fell silent. The entity's rage condensed into a point of absolute stillness, the calm before some unimaginable storm. "Something's wrong," Catherine whispered, watching as the pool's surface grew unnaturally still. "This isn't finished." The 4 spoons began to vibrate in their stone depressions, no longer glowing but now absorbing light. Eleanor stepped forward cautiously, academic instinct compelling her to observe what even fear said to flee. "The children are gone," she said, "but the doorway remains open." Against the far wall, previously hidden symbols emerged from the rock as if revealed by invisible fire, carvings older than Celtic wisdom, older perhaps than human memory. They depicted not children at tea, but the same circular pool now exposed before them, with something enormous emerging from its depths. Daniel translated the ancient text with growing horror. It says, "The innocent are the key, but not the lock." The children were never the entity's true goal. They were just the mechanism. Charlotte approached the pool's edge, medical precision overcoming instinctive dread. It wasn't feeding on the children at all, she realized. It was using them as bait, creating a pattern humans would maintain out of love and grief, generation after generation. The truth revealed itself with terrible clarity. The entity hadn't been contained by the ritual. It had created it, crafting over centuries a perfect summoning disguised as a remembrance. The Victorian spiritualists, the grieving parents through history, even Eleanor and her fellow guardians, all had been manipulated into maintaining a ritual whose true purpose remained hidden under sorrow's perfect camouflage. "We didn't free the children," Eleanor whispered. "We completed the sequence." The pool's surface rippled at last, not from something entering, but from something preparing to emerge. The entity on the stairwell was merely its shadow, its herald, a fragment of consciousness sent ahead to ensure the ritual's completion. Margaret's final journal pages, which Eleanor had dismissed as an elderly woman's paranoia, now echoed with prophetic truth. The circle must never be completed. Better the children remain as guards than as keys. In sending the children onward, they had removed the final barrier. The spoons began to sink into the stone as if it were liquid, the silver darkening to obsidian. From the pool rose a scent unlike anything in living memory, the smell of stars consuming themselves. 400 years of tea parties, Catherine whispered. 400 years of sustaining children between worlds, not to feed on them, but to keep them as innocents guarding the door. Their presence was the only thing keeping it contained. The water began to boil, not with heat, but with ancient, patient malevolence. "Elizabeth wasn't warning us," Charlotte said, her face pale with understanding. "She was thanking us. They wanted release at any cost. They knew what would follow." As the chamber shuddered around them, Eleanor finally understood the true horror of the Harrington photograph. Not that a little girl had set places for her dead siblings, but that something ancient had taught humanity to maintain its prison's key through the most powerful force imaginable, a family's unending love. The revelation fractured reality for the four guardians as they stood at the edge of existence. Eleanor collapsed against the ancient stone wall, academic detachment abandoned as the enormity of their error crushed her. They had been played not just across years or decades, but millennia, a long game of cosmic horror where human grief served as the perfect perpetual engine. Beneath them, the chamber floor cracked in perfect concentric circles radiating from the pool. The fissures ran up the walls, revealing more ancient carvings beneath Victorian stonework, beneath Roman foundations, beneath Neolithic constructions, each layer showing the same entity depicted with increasing reverence the deeper the archaeology reached. "We've destroyed everything Margaret's circle worked to maintain," Catherine whispered, her ancestors' burden now fully comprehended. They knew the terrible choice: imprison innocent children as eternal guardians, or release something that existed before humanity drew breath. Charlotte tried desperately to reinsert her spoon back into the stone, but the depression had sealed completely. "Can we call them back? The children? Maybe they could return." Her healer's instinct sought compromise even at the precipice. "They're finally at peace," Daniel said, his scholar's mind racing through possibilities. "We can't ask them to return to eternal imprisonment, even to save ourselves." The stairway they had descended now stretched impossibly upward, the exit receding beyond sight. Eleanor's phone displayed nonsensical time, all numbers spinning randomly as if fundamental constants themselves were becoming unstable. "The tea ritual," Eleanor said suddenly, her researcher's instinct breaking through terror. "We've been looking at it backward. It wasn't that the ritual contained the entity. The ritual was teaching us how to contain it whenever it finally emerged." From their packs, they retrieved the final items Margaret had insisted they bring: 4 ordinary white teacups, artifacts so mundane they'd barely registered them as significant. "We offer ourselves," Charlotte understood first, setting her cup at the pool's edge, not as food, but as vessels, the opposite of what happened to the children. The others followed, forming a new circle around the darkening water. The entity surging below projected not thoughts but primal emotions, hunger beyond satisfaction, patience beyond time, and something unexpected: reluctant respect for these tiny consciousnesses that had maintained the prison for so long. 400 years of tea parties, Catherine echoed, filling her cup with water from a silver flask. 400 years of teaching us the ritual that would be needed when the children could no longer bear their burden. They understood now, with terrible clarity, the true nature of the silver spoons, the cups, the weekly ceremony. Not a prison for what stirred below, but a training manual for humanity, teaching the pattern that would be required when the original guardians could no longer sustain their vigil. The water in their cups began to darken, not with tea, but with something ancient and essential, the raw material of consciousness itself. In a universe that had always been a tea party between the infinite and the ephemeral, they would take the children's place as guardians, not of the gate, but of the entity itself. As they raised their cups in unison, Eleanor realized that in the end, the most profound horror was not that monsters exist, but that holding them at bay requires an eternal sacrifice someone must consciously choose to make. Into the stillness of that ancient chamber beneath the Harrington property, the four guardians raised their cups in perfect unison. They drank not tea, but something older, a distillation of boundary and threshold, of duty accepted with open eyes rather than inherited through manipulation. As the liquid passed their lips, each experienced a private revelation, a glimpse of what they were containing, what had waited patiently as civilizations rose and crumbled above its prison. The chamber stabilized around them, the cracks sealing themselves as a new equilibrium established. The pool's surface calmed, though something vast still moved beneath it, no longer straining upward but settling into a different pattern. 4 silver chains materialized, extending from the guardian's wrists to the water's depths, visible only when the light struck them at certain angles. "We've become the new anchors," Charlotte whispered, examining the ethereal bond. Not victims or unwitting participants, but conscious wardens. In the village above, clocks resumed their normal function as the unnatural weather dissipated. Children who had been drawing the same haunting images suddenly stopped, pencils dropping from their hands as if waking from a shared dream. At hospices across Britain, young patients reported their spectral visitors had bid them final farewells. The original photograph, that seemingly innocent image of Elizabeth Harrington's tea party that had sparked Eleanor's investigation, underwent a subtle transformation in archives and collections worldwide. The empty chairs remained, but the shadows behind them had vanished, replaced by ordinary afternoon light. The little girl's expression, once interpreted as eerie communion with the unseen, now showed only the quiet sadness of genuine grief. The photograph was never evidence of haunting, Eleanor realized as they ascended the transformed staircase, which now led directly to the garden above. It was a warning across time, a message in the only language the entity couldn't corrupt. Their commitment came with unexpected grace. While bound to maintain regular gatherings at the anchor sites, they remained otherwise free to live their lives. Daniel continuing his library work with new insight into ancient texts, Catherine establishing a foundation to preserve esoteric knowledge, Charlotte returning to hospice care with deeper understanding of transition's sacred nature. Eleanor carefully documented everything in journals designed to guide future guardians, encoding crucial information in ways that would resist manipulation. When visitors to her cottage remarked on the curious tea ritual she maintained every Sunday afternoon, she simply smiled and spoke of honoring old family traditions. The silver spoons remained in their possession, transformed like their owners, ordinary in appearance, but humming with subtle power when the boundary required reinforcement. The 5th cup never reappeared, though sometimes at twilight, something vast seemed to watch from just beyond perception, not with malevolence, but with the patient acknowledgement that exists between ancient adversaries who understand their necessary balance. In Eleanor's garden, 4 small rose bushes now bloomed where the children had once taken tea, 1 white, 1 red, 1 pink, 1 yellow, their fragrance particularly sweet on Sunday afternoons. Beneath them, the earth remained perpetually warm, even in deepest winter, as if something far below acknowledged the sacrifice that had transformed prison into covenant. The whispers began 3 years after the new covenant was established, subtle at first. A child in Yorkshire drawing the same 5-pointed star in her notebook each day. A teenager in Cornwall suddenly taking afternoon tea with invisible companions. Eleanor tracked these occurrences methodically, noting their distance from the anchor points, searching for patterns that might indicate a weakness in the boundary. "It's testing us," she told the other guardians during their quarterly gathering at Catherine's countryside manor. "Not trying to break free, but measuring our resolve." The most troubling development came from Charlotte, who had noticed a peculiar pattern among her hospice patients. Children nearing death increasingly reported dreams of a garden tea party where an empty chair waited specifically for them. "They describe it as comforting," Charlotte explained, "but the description matches too closely with what we know. The entity may be adapting its approach, offering gentle invitation rather than frightening manifestation." Daniel arrived late to their meeting, carrying a weathered journal he'd discovered in a private collection in Edinburgh. This belonged to Elspeth Merriweather, Augustus Merriweather's wife. he explained, carefully turning brittle pages. She understood something her husband didn't, that the entity isn't singular. The revelation stunned them into silence before Catherine spoke. Not one presence but many, or perhaps one consciousness with many aspects. Daniel continued. Elspeth documented how different families experienced different manifestations. Some reported a presence that felt ancient and patient. Others described something voracious and immediate. She believed we weren't containing a single entity, but rather a boundary between realities. Eleanor thought of the photograph that had started her journey, how its meaning had transformed with understanding. That explains the children's crucial role. Their liminal state, caught between life and death, innocence and understanding, made them perfect mediators. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. And why my patients sense it now. They stand at that same threshold. The puzzle's final piece clicked into place when Catherine spread out a star chart showing celestial alignments across 2 millennia. Every 400 years, the alignment creates what mystical traditions call a thin moment, when boundaries naturally weaken. The Victorian containment wasn't random. It corresponded with the previous cycle. Eleanor calculated quickly, which means we have 397 years until the next major alignment, almost 4 centuries to prepare the next generation. Outside Catherine's window, an unexpected shower of rose petals swirled in perfectly circular formation despite the windless day. Acknowledgement from what waited beyond, perhaps, or a reminder from those who had stood guard before them. The 4 guardians raised their teacups in silent communion, understanding now that they weren't merely preventing catastrophe, but maintaining cosmic equilibrium. The burden they carried wasn't just humanity's protection, but also the entity's containment, a responsibility to both sides of an ancient boundary. As twilight descended, Eleanor watched the rose petals settle into the pattern of a perfect pentagram on Catherine's lawn. Within the pattern, 4 small indentations appeared, the size of children's footprints, but now facing outward, as if finally walking away from their centuries-long vigil. In the University of Edinburgh's Special Collections reading room, an elderly woman carefully closed the archival folder containing the final correspondence between Eleanor Wright and her fellow guardians. The archivist had warned her that few researchers requested these materials. Most preferred the sensational early documentation of the Harrington case rather than the decades of seemingly mundane tea ritual records that followed. "Find what you were looking for, Professor Pearson?" the archivist asked, approaching with the visitor log. Sophie Pearson nodded, her lined face thoughtful as she signed the register. 70 years had passed since she'd played in that garden as a child, since she'd set her plastic tea set by the ancient wall, and met 4 children who spoke of Elizabeth and her endless tea parties. "I was the last one they invited," she said softly, "before the new guardians took their place." The archivist smiled politely, accustomed to elderly researchers who occasionally blurred the boundary between scholarship and personal narrative. Sophie withdrew from her handbag a small photograph, that infamous image of Elizabeth Harrington's tea party that had fascinated generations. Unlike the copies in archives worldwide, this one remained unchanged. The shadows behind the empty chairs still visible, the little girl's expression still captured in that moment of uncanny communion. "I kept the original safe," she whispered. "Eleanor entrusted it to me before she passed. She said someone would need it when the alignment returns." At the reading room's far table, a young woman sat surrounded by books on Victorian spiritualism, her research interrupted by frequent glances toward Sophie. On the girl's wrist, a charm bracelet held 4 tiny silver spoons, family heirlooms, she'd explained earlier, passed through generations with strict instructions never to remove them. Sophie approached her with purpose, placing the photograph before the startled researcher. "You've been dreaming of them, haven't you?" Sophie asked gently. 4 children who invite you to tea, and something vast watching from behind them." The young woman's eyes widened in recognition. "How did you know?" "The bloodlines always find their way back to service," Sophie replied. "The guardians are aging. The cycle prepares to renew itself." Outside the library windows, 4 distinct shadows stretched across the lawn, despite the cloudy Scottish afternoon. Child-sized silhouettes that remained stationary, while ordinary shadows shifted with the hidden sun's movement. "They're not haunting us," Sophie explained, her finger tracing the outline of Elizabeth's face in the photograph. "They're warning us. The invitation isn't to a tea party, but to understanding what waits beneath ordinary reality." She pressed the photograph into the young woman's trembling hands. The next alignment comes sooner than calculated. Time moves differently near boundaries. As the young researcher examined the image, something shifted in its sepia depths. Elizabeth Harrington seemed to look directly at her, the child's lips forming words across the century that separated them. Your turn now. Behind them, 4 empty chairs at the reading room table tilted slightly toward their conversation, casting shadows longer and darker than they should in the library's even lighting. A quiet reminder that some invitations once recognized cannot be declined. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.